And tonight, in our Bible class, we're going to be jumping back in to the story of David. And so we find ourselves in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And as we're accustomed to, we're going to try to reorient ourselves in the narrative of what's going on. And so for over a decade, David has been waiting for the promise of God to come true. David is the shepherd young man who is out shepherding his father's sheep, and all of a sudden he gets a message he needs to go to his father's house immediately. Something wrong. He gets there and he finds Samuel the prophet, who is the most well-known rock star figure in Israel's history. I mean, he is the greatest judge Israel has ever had. He's judged Israel since he was a teenager. Everybody in Israel knows exactly who Samuel is. And so when he gets there, Samuel is there, and Samuel anoints him as the future king of Israel. And then things just kind of take off at a rapid pace. And so before he knows it, David is before King Saul, playing the lyre for him, trying to calm him of his mal-attitude, the things he has going on mentally. David's there. David winds up killing Goliath, the Philistine giant. Then he becomes a captain in Saul's army. He becomes the captain of the king's bodyguard. He marries the princess Michal. And then all of a sudden, he's on the run. So for 2-3 years, he's in the royal family. He's a rock star. Everybody in Israel knows his name. All the young girls sing, Saul has killed his thousands, but David is 10,000s. He's ruddy. He's handsome. He's got everything, right? And then all of a sudden, in a flip of a switch, Saul realizes that David's the one who's going to come after his throne. And so for about 7 years, David has to live as a fugitive on the run, looking over his shoulder for Saul and Saul's army. Well, eventually, Saul's going to die at the hand of the Philistines, along with the princes of Israel. And then there's going to be a 2-year war between David and Ishbosheth, who is the last remaining son of Saul. And so when you look at it, I mean, it's a very long, drawn-out process of over a decade. But finally it's over. Saul and his heirs are dead, and he is the undisputed heavyweight champion. I mean, there's nobody else on the scene that can rival David's authority, both his authority and coming from being appointed by the prophet of God, Samuel, before his death, but also the authority now David has an army. And so over the last decade, David's been formulating this army that he has, and that army is about to get a whole lot bigger. And so we find ourselves in 2 Samuel chapter 5, where David has already been crowned the king of Judah. Judah is just one of 12 tribes in Israel. So he's been crowned the king of Judah, but now he's about to be crowned the king of all Israel. And Abner, before he was murdered, Abner was the cousin of Saul. He was the commander of Saul's army. Then after Saul's death, he was the commander of Ishbosheth's army and fought against David for 2 years. And then Abner tells David, I know that God has blessed you and God has promised you the throne. Ishbosheth is an idiot. And so this is over. And so Abner is the one who goes to all the elders of Israel and says, it's time for us to recognize David as the true king. All the elders get on board. Abner goes to the capital city, Hebron, to tell David the good news. And while he is there, he's murdered by Joab, David's nephew, and also his commander of armies. And so there's some worry that David has that the nation of Israel, the elders, will pull out now that his nephew and commander has lied and murdered Abner, this powerful man in Israel, but it doesn't happen. They say, we realize that you had nothing to do with it, and everything's going to be okay. And so we find ourselves at the coronation, if you will. Let's read verses 1-5. Yes.
A couple weeks ago, I was going to ask you, it talks about David leading the army out again, and David was 10,000 and all this. Was he ever ahead of the army, or was Abner always ahead, of the army there under Saul?
That's a great question, and it's hard to say for certain because we know that Abner's the commander. Now, we don't see Abner's name until after David is already on the run. Now, could that mean that he's not until David leaves, or that he's promoted in David's absence? Or is it the fact that he has multiple commanders? That may be the case. So like with the mighty men, you had the commander. Joab is called the commander of the army, but then you have is Abishai the commander of the mighty men? It's somebody else. It's not Joab. So it may be more so like you have these companies. And so I know when David is there, the text says that he's the captain of the king's guard. And so, it could be multiple generals, right? Kind of like the army, you may have this general over this area or this general over these people. So it could be something along those lines.
I was wondering because you think about them chasing him for all their time, and if he was the top man in the army, I mean,
Mhm.
they're chasing after a guy that they had a lot of loyalty with, a lot of
Yeah.
trust in, because since Saul's, he's getting older, he's not going out for a lot of these things. David is the guy.
Yeah.
So if he was the top one, you think about how hard were they really,
Yeah.
to get somebody that felt that way.
No, I think that's a great insight. I think you see that with the men that are kind of stripping away from Saul and going to David, and the fact that they're some of the more elite members of Israel when it comes to warfare. And I also think that for those who are not in the know, because David's anointing has been kind of a private ordeal, that they still recognize Saul as being the anointed king, which may, for some people might not mean very much, but for some it does, like David and probably others too, that don't recognize David as being anointed by Samuel to be the next king. But over time, they've come to realize that's the case. That's a really good point too, because we read verses 1-5, the elders of Israel who have not recognized David as the king are going to say, we know, right? And one of the reasons they know is they recognize that God's with him. David's going out on these raids, these campaigns, and everywhere where Saul was failing, he's winning. And so it's just obvious that God has chosen him, right? Because in the ancient world, you have team A and team B. They fight. Team B wins. But who does God love more? Team B, right? It's like if you have a job offer, right? And you say, God, show me which job you want me to take. And company A comes back and says, we'll pay you $100,000. And company B says, we'll pay you $300,000. Guess which one God wants you to take? $300,000, and give accordingly, right? No, that's just a little joke. No, but I mean, show me a sign. Well, 3 times the income is a pretty good sign. I don't know. Obviously I jest, but I mean, people are always looking for trying to read the runes, right? They're trying to figure out, okay, who does God favor? Well, in the ancient world, it's pretty obvious, right? Whoever wins. And that's kind of how God shows his favor to David. He always wins, right? And so that's what the elders literally say here in verses 1-5. So let's go ahead and read verses 1-5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be my shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. And King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David as king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. And so some things that we see here is that when the elders come, kind of like Tim and I were talking about just a second ago, they recognize, they say, we understand that whenever the army was going in and out, it was you the one who were leading the army and getting all these victories, right? So before Saul started losing to the Philistines, which was pretty commonplace at the end of his reign, and then he loses terribly there at the very end, before then, whenever he was winning on the tail end of his reign, now you got to give Saul credit. We beat up on Saul a lot for the last several weeks. But when Saul starts out as a young king, very brave, very warrior, very brave, likes to fight. 1 Samuel 14 says that he defeats all of Israel's enemies. So you got to give him his due. But he loses it, right? He loses his devotion to God. He loses his desire to lead the army in battle. And so, David is the one who does that after defeating Goliath the giant. And so they recognize David's service to the nation, that God's been blessing David now for over a decade. I remember over a decade ago when you were leading the army out into battle and defeating the Philistines. And remember, the Philistines are the most elite fighting nation in this part of the world at this time, okay? They're not just they're not the Ammonites, right? They're not even like, the Amalekites. I mean, these people are the cousins to the Greeks who were going to take over the world in, 300 BC with Alexander. They have the same weaponry. They fight in kind of a phalanx style. They have the best chariots in this part of the ancient world. And so anytime the Israelites go out and defeat the Philistines, guess what it's seen as? a miracle. And not just like, oh, we beat the number one team in the country. It's a miracle. No, like God did this. Okay. They're bigger, they're faster, they're stronger, they're better equipped, right? They're better trained. Like if we beat them, it's a sign of God's favor, right? And so they're saying that we know God's with you because you used to go out and beat the Philistines. And you couldn't have done that if God wasn't on your side, right? And they recognize that he's been anointed. So that it was private whenever David was anointed by Samuel, but that's now common knowledge, evidently. And they say that God said that you're going to be the shepherd of the nation, which is kind of ironic because what was David before he was anointed by Samuel? A shepherd, right? Then you have all those passages that David writes, like in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Jesus in John 10 says, I am the good, right? So you see this imagery, right, that David is going to shepherd the people of God, right, that he's going to lead them. He's not going to abuse them or to manipulate them. He's going to be their protector, their provider, their sustainer. This is going to be a benevolent relationship between David and the people. And so that he's crowned in an official religious ceremony. We don't have time to really look at it and to read it. But David's about 30 years old whenever he begins to rule. Somebody else started something kind of important when he was 30, about 30. Jesus' ministry, and Jesus is the son of David. So there's a little connection there, right? So David becomes king at 30. Jesus starts his earthly ministry about the age of 30, we're told in the book of Luke. And so when this takes place, looking at 1 Chronicles chapters 11 through 14, there's some additional details that we see. This feast lasts for 3 days. And so in 340,000 men, and they're listed there, you can look at those at a different time, but 340,000 men come and pledge their allegiance, fighting men, not just like any man, but like men of war, like fighting age, 20 to 45, right? Come make the trip to Hebron, the capital city, and basically bow down, kiss the ring, and say, I'll fight for you, right? Kind of a thing you have to do in the ancient world, right? And so now David's army has now just, exploded. It's where it's going to be a real army and a real kingdom. And so he rules for 7.5 years at Hebron, and he rules for 33 years in Jerusalem. So now it's time for David to go on the attack, right? So he's been kind of defensive, fleeing from Saul. He's been attacking for the last several years. He's been doing raids on the Amalekites and the Canaanites that are kind of in the south of Israel, around the tribe of Judah's lands. But now he's getting ready for a real army to go out and fight, real, set piece battles. And so David doesn't waste any time, we're told. And so immediately he looks to conquer the city of Jerusalem. And so let's read verses 6. Let's read verses 6 through 10. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking to themselves, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David, and David said on the day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up to the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. And so let's talk a little bit about Jerusalem, a city that plays such a important and key place in the biblical narrative, obviously in the Old Testament being the city, the capital city of Israel and the capital city of Judah after the kingdoms divide. Obviously, it's the place where Jesus preached and taught and walked and was crucified, where the early church began. The interesting thing is that for the last 400 years, it's not even been an Israelite city. So it's just on the northern side of Judah, but it's actually in Benjamite territory. The Bible tells us that the Benjamites could not take Jerusalem, right? They could not get the Jebusites out. It's well fortified. It's got good fortifications just naturally. It's kind of on we would call them hills, like really big hills, but they call them mountains. And so, so just kind of interesting. It's called Jebus in the Bible before David conquers it, but one of the things that we can see from archaeology and other evidence is that it was always called Jerusalem for the most part. We've got Egyptian texts that date back even as early as 2200 BC and it's called Jerusalem, or pretty close to it. And so they may have called it the city of the Jebus or something like that, because that's where the Jebusites lived. But even before David takes it in 1000 BC, nearly 1,000 years earlier, we have Egyptian records that refer to this as being close to like Jerusalem, which is what Jerusalem is. And so it's a really hard city to overtake. Like we said before, it's got natural fortifications. On top of these natural fortifications, they've got man-made fortifications. So they feel really, really secure, right? David comes with his army, and what do they think? Oh no, sue for peace, right? What do they think? What's the text say? Yeah, he's not getting in, right? They said David can't come in here. We'll put the lame LeBlanc on the city walls. It doesn't matter what we do because you're not getting in, right? And so they feel like for 400 years, nobody's been able to conquer their city, right? And so they feel very well and secure. Was there a walled city previously in the history of God's people that felt really secure behind their walls? Jericho, right? And so they must have forgotten that story, right? The interesting thing is that David mentions a water shaft here. And so there was a water shaft that went down to the spring of Gihon, where if you were inside the city walls during a siege, you could go to that water shaft and get water, even while there was an army outside. And taking Jerusalem is hard. Nobody's done it for 400 years. And even after the Israelites take the land, the Assyrians don't take it, right? The largest empire of the world is known at that time. The Assyrians don't do it. The Babylonians do, and the Romans do later, but they find out it's very hard. It's very hard to do. You can take it, but it's going to be very costly. And so, but it's also an important city for other reasons, and its connections back in the book of Genesis. And so it's the city where Melchizedek was the priest and king. And so Melchizedek was the priest of Salem, right? And so, and it's also Mount Moriah, which is where the temple will eventually be built, is the place where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, right? So there's a lot of connections there, even going back to Abraham and Isaac and Melchizedek earlier on in the biblical story. And so David and his army conquer it. The Bible tells us that David easily conquers it. So not only does David conquer the city, but he does it easily. And why is David able to easily conquer the city? Verse 10, right? David grew greater and greater because God was with him. That's what made the difference. Saul couldn't defeat the Philistines because God wasn't with him. Saul couldn't find David for 7 years and kill him, even though that was his own personal pet project, because God wasn't with him, right? And so the difference, the contrast here is that God is with David. And so David is being established. David is going to have a capital city. David is going to do all these things. And so here on this map, you can see, if you zoom in, you can see Hebron, which is the very lowest city on your map to the south. You go a little bit north in a straight line, you're going to see Bethlehem. And then if you keep going north in a straight line, just across the border of into Benjamin, that's where Jerusalem is. And so that's going to be where the capital city is going to be. And so David decides that for his new kingship over Israel, he needs a new city. And so he decides this new city is going to be the stronghold that God has given to him. And he calls it the city of David because, he's the one who conquered the city, right? And so, what better place to rule from than a city that's named after yourself? Mark? Oh.
Is there any other Canaanite culture that existed inside that same footprint of those 12 tribes other than Jebusites?
Yeah, the Gibeonites. And so we know the Gibeonites are still there because the Gibeonites are the ones, remember, whenever Joshua, when they enter the land of Canaan, the Gibeonites show up and they've got on old dirty clothes and the moldy bread and say that we're from a faraway place, make a peace treaty with us. And then, so we know the Gibeonites are there because they're mentioned throughout the Old Testament. And there probably is pockets of Canaanite cultures, but maybe not a whole lot of cities themselves that are insulated cities to say. Yeah. And in a really important place too, right? So the Jebusites is situated basically on the road that because it's a very mountainous region when you get close to the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea, And so it's a really good place because if you look, you can kind of see it's kind of mountainous. If you, that's a topographical map, so you can see the elevation shoots up on both sides of Jerusalem. So it's almost like a choke point or a bottleneck, and so it's a logistically important place to be, militarily, economically, and so it's a good place for a capital. Good question, Ken. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you may have some other interpretations about that, but no, I think that Melchizedek was a real guy who was a king and a priest. Yeah. No, I mean, Melchizedek is a descendant of Noah. I mean, everybody is basically, I guess, technically. But we do know there were certain priests that were faithful to God at that time. You've got Melchizedek, who's there. You've got Moses' father-in-law, who's a high priest, and he's a Midianite, which is another kind of Canaanite people that are there coming in the Arabian Peninsula. And so you still had some carryovers. Now, that's been a long time. I mean, from the time frame of, Melchizedek to David it's 1,000 years. So it's a long time to go off the rails, right? Good question. All right, good. Another thing is strategic. Who was the last king of Israel? Saul. Where was Saul from? Benjamin, right? And so, anybody remember where the original capital of the U.S. was? History majors out there? Philadelphia, right? At least that's when I think of the original one. That's what I think of, right? And so even during the Continental Congress and things of that nature, there was already kind of a north and south divide, and we all know how that ended up. But that was already kind of starting. And so if you remember, they decided that for a new country, we're going to have a new capital, and we're going to go to kind of a neutral site. We're going to go to Maryland and Virginia, a northern state and a southern state, and we'll both give up a little bit and make a new place. It'll be like a meet in the middle. Right. We both got, saying, because they were like, if we have it in, Virginia, people up north get upset. If we leave it in Philadelphia, the Virginians get real mad and they'll be upset. Right. So that was part of a compromise. David does something kind of similar. He doesn't even put his new capital in the land of Judah. He puts it in Benjamin. Right. And so, I think there's also a little bit of political stuff here too. That's important. And so, this is kind of a drawing of what Jerusalem would look like at the time of David. And so you can see here it's a walled city, not overly large, but it's a city in the ancient world. This is where it is today. And so you can still see how it kind of jets up at a higher elevation. And so here's the modern city of Jerusalem today, and that's the city of David that dates back to his reign. Okay, so sorry, can't have myself. So the Jebusites, not afraid of David at all. They taunt him from inside the walls. David and his men easily take the city. David says, whoever the first one is over the wall or inside the city is going to be my commander, which is kind of it's very common in the ancient world to say the first person over the city is going to get X, Y, or Z, right? And so pretty common in the ancient world. It's kind of a way to motivate your soldiers to run to near certain death, right? And so if you make it, you'll be rich, And so, but Joab, is the commander of the army already, but he's the first one inside the city, so he keeps his title. But David tells them to go up the water shaft, and I'll show you a picture of that here in a minute. And so David makes it his new capital city. And let's read verses 11 through 16. And Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters and masons who built David a house. And David knew the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came to Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And then it lists the names of those that were born to him while he was in Jerusalem. And so David takes the city. He makes it his capital. Hiram, who is the king of Tyre, and we have extra biblical evidence for Hiram and the kingdom of Tyre. And so, what was the kingdom of Tyre? The kingdom of Tyre is on the coast of the land of Canaan and the Mediterranean Sea. They were Phoenicians. They were excellent sailors and had a really, really wealthy and influential kingdom. So this was a really good ally to have. So they're probably one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the world. And so the fact that David is able to become king and so soon have such a powerful, wealthy, influential ally is just another sign of God's blessing to David. And so here's the tunnel. And so this tunnel dates back to the Jebusites. And so there's several tunnels that are under the city of Jerusalem. Some were built by Hezekiah. Some were built even before, like this one, the Jebusites. And this is the tunnel that Joab and his men would have gotten to and went through to get inside the city. And once you're inside the city, you can open the gates. You can do whatever you want. And so this is a map of Tyre, one of the coolest stories in all of the ancient world. If you notice here, so here's a larger map of Canaan. You can see Jerusalem on your map. If you go north, you can see Tyre and Sidon. They're like sister cities. So they're both Phoenician cities. And oftentimes the king were over both of those. But after the Babylonian destruction of old Tyre, they go out into the ocean to an island. So there's an island about 1 kilometer off the coast, right? So it's several hundreds of yards. It's far enough away where you feel pretty protected. It's got massive walls, super expensive, just a beautiful, beautiful ancient city. Okay. Well, when the Persians are the rulers of the world, the Persians are their overlord. And so when Alexander the Great comes down, he comes down into Anatolia, modern day Turkey, and he goes down. And the Persian army hadn't got there yet. I mean, so he's defeated a couple of small armies, but like Darius hadn't come with his 1 million-man army yet. So Alexander goes to the kingdom of Tyre and says, recognize me as your king. King of Tyre says, no. Alexander says, recognize me as your king. He's like, dude, Darius is going to come with 1 million men. Like, you got what, 50,000 soldiers? Like, no, if I recognize you as king, what's going to happen to me when Darius gets here, right? And so Alexander, it's an island. Alexander makes his men cut down the cedars of Tyre and build a land bridge all the way out there to the city and destroys the city of Tyre, right? And today, that's no longer an island. So if you look at that second map, you can see where the original bridge built by Alexander is and just how much it's been built out since then. So it's no longer an island. And so basically Alexander spent months to conquer the city. And guess who sent them supplies while they were being besieged by the Greeks? The people in Jerusalem. So whenever Alexander got done with Tyre, he turned and was going straight for Jerusalem to destroy Jerusalem for backing Tyre when it was not submitting to Alexander, because the Jerusalem didn't either. Anyways, so a little sidetrack, but kind of interesting story. So David now turns his ire towards the Philistines. And so verses 17 through 21, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard it and went to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. Therefore the name of the place is called Baal Perazim. And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. And so the Philistines hear that David is the new king of Israel, and the Philistines have been pretty much lording over the Israelites for 400 years. I mean, the Philistines pretty much have their way with the Israelites. They go in every once in a while, take their land, take their crops, raid their cities, enslave the people. The Philistines they're just really bad people. And so for 400 years, there's been a couple of victories. Saul and Jonathan have a victory in 1 Samuel 13. Samuel has a victory at Mizpah, like in 1 Samuel chapter 7, maybe 8. I don't remember what it is. And so there's been a couple of victories, but I mean, 400 years, you've had like 3 victories over the Philistines, and they just absolutely smoked you a few years ago. Killed your king, killed the princes, destroyed the army of Israel. I mean, like, so when they hear that David has become the new king of Israel, well, now it's time to do something. Because before, you had Ishbosheth and David fighting a civil war. If you're an outside power, you love that, man. I mean, they're just fighting against each other, killing each other, right? And you're just kind of going in and picking things off whenever you want to. But now that David has consolidated power, that's no good. So we need to snuff this out in the cradle, before this gets, any worse. And so they assemble a large army to invade, no doubt very confident. They get to Rephaim, which is about a mile away from Jerusalem. So you can feel the tension, right? David's this new king. He's taking this new city, and now all of a sudden there's this massive Philistine army that's there. And what David does first is what we see Saul didn't do many times. The first thing David does is say what? Yeah. He didn't say, well, I killed Goliath when I was barely a man. He didn't say, well, I fought the Philistines before and won, right? So there's no hubris, there's no arrogance. I took the Jebusites. Nobody's taken them 400 years, right? And so the very first thing he does is to ask God if he should go up to fight. Now, did Saul ask God if he should fight the Philistines? He did. He did. But did God answer back? No. That's the difference, right? Saul had done so many things in his life before without asking God. When it got to the end, he asked and God didn't listen, or God didn't respond, right? And so by the time that Saul decided it was time to ask God for his opinion on the matter, it was too late. And so, but David hasn't done that, right? And so David, first thing he does is says yes, and it's a smashing victory for Israel. They flee, they leave their idols. First Chronicles 14:22 tells us they take the idols and they burn them. First Chronicles 14:12, not 22, I'm sorry. And burn the idols. And so, but then the Philistines think, you know what? He jumped us. Let's go back. And so you see verses 22 to 25. The Philistines came yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come against the opposite, the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, you rouse yourself, for the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded him and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. And so here we have the second battle. And so the Philistines regroup. They decide they're going to invade again. They've learned their lesson. And David, once again, he doesn't have hubris. He isn't arrogant. He doesn't say, well, we beat him before, The very first thing he does is ask God if he should attack. And God says no. He says, instead of going up and attacking them from the front like we did last time, that's what you're going to do for an even better victory. You're going to march around to their rear, right? Now, those two things. What does going to their rear do? What are some benefits to that? Yeah. Cut off their supply caravans. And if there is a battle, what else have you cut off? No escape route, no retreat, right? And so the Philistines, the Israelites came and charged them from the front the first time. They think the Israelites are going to do the exact same thing again. God says, no, march around them, go to the back. That's exactly what David does. And he says, I want you to wait in the balsam trees. And the Hebrew there is very difficult. It's probably like the bushes, And when you hear the chariots on top of the trees, that's when you know it's time to attack, right? And so what is the symbolism there? What chariots is David going to hear in the top of trees? What was that? The Lord's, right? It's not his chariots, ain't Philistine chariots. It's the Lord of hosts, right? And so God's going to be the one that gives the victory. And so when you hear the chariots above your heads, you're going to know the Lord of hosts is with you, and it's time to start the battle. And they do. The Bible says that they defeat them from Geba to Gezer. Basically, they attack them, they fight them, and they just cut them down all the way back to their Philistine cities. And so it's a major, major victory for Israel. and the Philistines really ceased to be a threat for a long time. We're going to read about them a few times in the David's reign, but nothing like they've been the last 400 years. We're not going to be a problem during Solomon's reign. I mean, really, they're defeated so soundly that David pretty much extinguishes a 400-year fire that's been plaguing Israel ever since they got in the land of Canaan. So really important victory for him. David's fame and reputation continue to spread throughout the area. In 1 Chronicles chapter 14, verse 17, it says, "And the fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought fear upon the fear of him upon all nations." And so, there's a new sheriff in town. The kingdom of Israel has never been stronger. It's never been bigger. And throughout David's reign, it's just going to get larger and larger and more powerful. And so, any questions or comments on 1 Samuel chapter 5? John?
Some of these Philistine leaders, they were known as David, right? When he was at that other Philistine city.
Yeah, no, definitely. Certainly Achish, right? And his commanders and army. And interestingly enough, we'll read about them in a little while, but there are actually 600 Philistine soldiers who have defected, which is not that's pretty much David's entire army while he's out in the wilderness. But there's 600 Philistine soldiers who have defected and are actually in David's army because they're with David for roughly 2 years and have seen David and been impressed and basically have more than likely converted to the true God and now are warriors for David. And so, but yeah, they would have definitely, some of them at least would have definitely known David. They all would have heard of David, right? Because even a couple of years earlier when Saul was defeated and David's there, all the Philistine kings are like, "No, David can't come with us." And Achish is like, no, we're buddies. Like, he's been helping me. They're like, no, like he's not doing that. Right? We don't trust David. Good. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah. They did. And one of the requirements for the law of Moses was to not enter into covenants with the foreign peoples. And so now we don't know if they established some type of covenant, right? Or they were just gifts from one king to another, which wasn't too uncommon in the ancient world. And so don't know. In the end, Tyre is going to give Israel something really, really bad in the end. And of course, I'm talking about Jezebel, right? And she's basically going to, help the entire northern. It's already falling, but she's going to kind of help kick the bucket when it comes to Northern Kingdom. So, yeah, the cedars, right? And so the cedars that they give help to build the palace and also the temple, right? So, yeah. So.
Is it true that, let me ask you this, did David ever tell anybody that he was anointed by God? I mean, did Samuel?
Mm-hmm. I've done it in this class more than once. Yeah. The Saul and Samuel thing.
Yeah. I mean, so nobody knew?
Yeah. Well, his family knew. So when Samuel anoints David, his family is there. Right. And so, if there's any extended family or house servants, we don't know. But David doesn't go out and announce it. And everybody else pretty much keeps it hush hush. Now, we're not told, but it seems to me that whenever David is in the caves of Adullam, that it becomes known to his men that he's the anointed of God, because that's one of the reasons that they try to get him to kill Saul, is that you're the anointed king. Like, you can kill him.
So you think that, Israel, once Saul was dead, they were kind of like, all right, I don't have to worry about saying this out loud.
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably a lot of people on the fence, right? And so there's people who are like, I know that. Yeah, like I know Saul is the anointed king. I was there when Samuel anointed him. And there's people who are saying that, that Samuel anointed David. So they may be on I don't know, right? I don't know what to do. And then by the time that David and his entire lineage gets killed out, well, then it's pretty obvious at that point. That I think that's what, yeah, whoever I said, you know what I'm trying to say. Just follow along, right? And so, but whenever Saul and all of his offspring are killed, well, then I think the hardliners, like the Benjamites, who are the last ones to kind of get on board, I think then they're all like, yeah, it's pretty obvious. Yeah. 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 But no, initially, no, they don't tell anybody. But I think whenever he's in the caves of Adullam, I think his men, whenever the men start coming to him, I think they're, talking about him being anointed in his future. And Abiathar, the high priest, is there. And so I think as it goes on, more and more people are like, it's becoming more and more clear. Yeah. It's a great question. Anyone else? No? All right. So some conclusions, seeking God's advice or wisdom. And so you can't go to Abiathar, the high priest, and ask him to take out the Urim and the Thummim and ask God a question and throw them down and see what God's going to say. You can't do that. But can you still seek God's advice and wisdom in your life today? Well, of course you can. Psalm 119, right? Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path, right? The word, 2 Timothy chapter 3, 16, 17, has equipped us and for all good works, right? So we can still seek God's wisdom and his advice today in our lives. Number 2, the Lord was with David, and that was evident in his life. And because of that, David had great confidence. God is with you, right? Matthew chapter 2, Emmanuel, God with us. Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age, Matthew 28. And so the Lord was with David, and that gave him an incredible amount of confidence and assurance. And the Lord is with you, and that ought to give you confidence and assurance too. And number 3, David was blessed for his faithfulness. The Bible also tells us that we're going to be blessed for our faithfulness. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll have, big houses and nice cars, but you will be blessed for your faithfulness. Well done, good and faithful servant. And so there's a lot of good things that we can see in the life of David that directly correspond to ourselves. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this evening that you've given to us to set some time aside to put away the cares of the world and to study more about your word, to study more about King David and his life. And dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful and thankful for the opportunity that we have to come and to dive deep into your word, to be able to glean from its pages and to apply these lessons to our own lives. And dear Heavenly Father, please help us to strive to be men and women after your own heart, to recognize that you are there with us, even in the midst of battles and hardships, and help us to walk faithfully with you each day. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.